Gossiping now is always seen as a bothersome and terrible construct where rumors are spread and information is sent from one end to the room to the other, when in actuality the original history of gossiping was used as a survival tool since time. However, due to the trickling events that would occur in the 12th century to the 21st century, gossip has been accompanied by the dangerous stigmatization of women. And with that in mind, they would be accompanied with a crime of humiliation for gossiping by being locked up by the neck and left outside at the mercy of the mocking crowd. The thew was a type of pillory similar to stocks specifically for women, and the woman would be chained to a post by her neck as a punishment for her crime. Unlike men, her hands weren't tied up, and common crimes include annoying your neighbors by talking too much or consummating outside of marriage. As for example, one woman named Anne Morrow in 1777, she was accused of impersonating a man and marrying another woman. She was put in the pillory and an angry crowd stoned her in resulting of her being blind. Number 9. Iron cages. They really didn't like it when women gossiped, or in most cases talked back in the day, especially when she would speak up or just discuss things. But words can only help you unless you speak them, and it's disappointing when people fail to understand that. Women who nagged would have metal spikes forced into their mouths, and the scold bridle was an iron cage for a woman's face, used to punish scolds, women who nagged, gossiped, talked back, or just talked too much. The bridle would be locked onto your head, and the protruding piece of metal covered in spikes would be forced inside your mouth, and every time you moved your tongue, the spikes would lacerate it. Sometimes the bridal woman would be chained to a hook by the fireplace in her home until she had learned her lesson, or she might be led through town wearing the mask to increase her humiliation. Number 8. Duck the scold. Unfortunately, another form of torment and punishment for women being tied to a chair at the end of a long, maneuverable wooden arm and dipped into frigid water. The punishment wasn't designed to be fatal, although sometimes it was, but rather a humiliating spectacle aimed at discouraging whatever behavior participated in it. There were various rituals for silencing women, as they have their roots in fear of women's speech and fear that women will attack other people in their community, that they gossip too much, that their voices were dangerous, and that they may, in extreme circumstances, also be witches. Though the women who ended up being on the ducking stool risked being accused of witchcraft, and the punishment, contrary to popular misconception, wasn't used to determine whether someone was a witch. A separate test, primarily known as the swimming witch, involved throwing a bound victim into a body of water to see if they'd float, a sure sign of guilt in the modern imagination. Subjects who sank were deemed innocent but could still wind up dead if they weren't rescued from the water in time. Few records about the women who were ducked survived. Much more information is available about the ducking stools themselves, their upkeep, about how they were kept into their construction. Number 7. Marking and tattooing. Although in some cultures tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but part of their heritage and even a source of pride. But in some cases, they would use it as a means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, famously marks its protagonist, Hester Prynne, with a red letter A for adultery for accusations about her behavior circulated. Hawthorne's book is more than fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crimes. Like Hester Prynne, A, or the letters AD as outlined by a Plymouth colony law from 1658, adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subject to public whipping and even further humiliation and social alienation. But keep in mind, Hawthorne was the descendant of the Judge Hathorne, who persecuted the lives of women who were accused of being witches, and he had such a disdain for his relative that he had changed his last name to distance himself from the relation of Hathorne from Hawthorne with a W. Number 6. Walk of Shame. Like in Game of Thrones, a pretty well-known show, I don't know if you guys heard of it, I'm rewatching it again up to a certain specific season. But there was that scene where Cersei was condemned for her crimes and had that lady yell shame as she rung a bell while Cersei was left parading the streets stripped naked. This is actually based as a form of torment for women, and the Walk of Shame, also known as skimmington or rough music, was a traditional punishment for harlotry, or being an overbearing wife. Women were made to walk barefoot through the town or city, sometimes dressed only in their petticoat. The street was filthy and sharp with rough stones, jeering crowds lined up to stare, and minstrels banging basins and pans would accompany the procession, adding to the woman's humiliation. Sometimes the skimmingtons were delivered by the townsfolk rather than the courts, and the accused might be dragged from their bed at night and paraded through the town with the crowd shouting obscene words at her. Unless she was quiet, subdued woman who followed every little thing she was supposed to do, she would be looked down on. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution. But for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are sadly identified only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the woman refused to comply or being able to commit to task, women as well as if the women refused to comply or unable to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4, domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common, as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors in marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, in a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, Asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note, those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past. Number 10, drowning. Drowning as a form of punishment was not a common practice practice in ancient Egypt, at least as far as historical records and archaeological evidence indicate. The ancient Egyptians had a legal system with various forms of punishment, but the various methods were typically less severe than drowning. But in records of the Code of Hammurabi, which was one of the oldest and known legal codes in human history, it provided a comprehensive set of laws covering a wide range of aspects of daily life, including civil, criminal, and commercial matters. One of the most famous aspects of the code is the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Mentioning drowning if there was adultery with a neighbor's wife, or if you had intimate relations with your daughter-in-law, more or less these punishments would go both ways, but interestingly enough, the laws depended on the person. Number 9. Disinheritance. In ancient Egypt, inheritance and property rights were complex and evolved over time, with some variations depending on the specific period and social status of individuals. Generally, women did have rights to inherit property, but there was significant differences between men and women in terms of inheritance. During the early dynastic periods, women had relatively more rights and they could inherit and own property. However, as the society became more stratified and centralized with the rise of the pharaonic state, inheritance laws became in favor more for males. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, women's rights to property and inheritance were gradually eroded. Property, especially land, was usually passed from father to son. Women could gain property through marriage contracts, dowries, or gifts, which they could then pass on to their children. But if they lose their inheritance, so do their children. Thankfully, there was legitimate ways of structuring a will, making unequal distributions of disinheriting a person so to minimize challenges which do not involve corporal punishment. These include a gift conditional upon the recipient not challenging the will, a no contest clause, diverting assets outside the will by writing a life insurance policy into trust, or passing assets through the will to a secret trust. Number 8. Banishment. In ancient Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the legal system was complex and the punishment for various offenses could vary depending on factors such as the severity of the crime, the societal status of an individual involved, and the time period in question. Banishment was one possible punishment, but it was not the common form of punishment. Banishment in ancient Egypt was being expelled from a community or city was generally used for serious offenses or crimes. It was a severe punishment because it meant the individual was cut off from their community and likely left to fend for themselves in the harsh environment outside settled areas. And for women, it was typically a rare occurrence as the legal system in ancient Egypt was based on the code of law that changed over time, and evidence suggests that women could be subjected to various forms of punishments for their crimes, including banishment. Number 7. Punishment. More commonly, punishments for women in ancient Egypt might have included fines, corporal punishments, or forced labor. For serious crimes, especially those that threatened the social order or involved treason, more severe punishments like execution might be applied, but in some cases for less serious offenses, women might be required to pay fines. These fines could be in the form of money, goods, or livestock. Women, particularly those of lower social status, could be sentenced to perform labor as a form of punishment. This might involve agriculture work, construction, or other forms of manual labor. Depending on the nature of the offense, a woman's property or belongings could be confiscated as a form of punishment. As mentioned earlier, banishment was a possible punishment for serious offenses. Number 6. Beatings. In ancient Egypt, like in many ancient societies, corporal punishment, including beatings, could be a form of punishment for women, particularly for offenses that were considered serious or morally reprehensible according to the prevailing nature and culture and legal norms. It's important to note that the application of punishment varied depending on factors such as societal status and specific time period and the region within ancient Egypt. Corporal punishments such as whipping, beating, or other forms of physical punishment could be administered for various offenses. This might be more common for crimes like theft or adultery. Examples would be like switches, flexible branches, or vines could have been used for beatings. They would be capable of inflicting pain without causing severe injury, as wooden paddles with a flat surface could also be used for beating as well. They would also have been effective in delivering blows to specific areas of the body, and the simplest form of beating would be involved with the hands and fists. This method would also be easily accessible and wouldn't have to require any specialized tools, as well as whips, sticks, and rods.
Number 5 is also used to shut wives and women up. It's the shrews, fiddle, and fife. I could be wrong. It could be pronounced fife like the country or fief like thief. Cannot tell for the life of me. Anyways, you've heard the boring shrew scold 100 times. I'm here to bring you a new exciting product if you want to publicly shame some women, but also simultaneously make it look like they're starting medieval times most vibing jazz band. The shrews fiddle or shame fiddle was a wooden contraption shaped roughly like a fiddle or a fife or fief or whatever it is, which is a type of flute that acted like a portable stalks for your fingers and your neck. The shame flute was specifically designed to punish those who made bad music. However, these shrews implements are titled after the ladies that were tossed in them constantly, people who spoke up to their husbands or argued with one another. The next 4 titles on this list, I'm not kidding, are all rippers of some kind. We're gonna start with number 4, the chest ripper. If I instinctually put my hands on my chest while we're talking, you will understand why in a second. This was a device made specifically and meant only for women to destroy a very specific aspect of femininity and thus remove what the medieval people perceived to be her desirability. And man, did these dudes have a weird ass fixation on doing stuff to breasts. Burned, brand, carved, or simply amputated. This is called sensual torture, but swap the N and the S for the letter X. It extends back to the time of ancient Rome and likely long before then too, but worst of all was a device coined in medieval England known as the breast ripper, a metal claw that pierced the flesh of the breast of the victim who was tied down and then pulled away forcibly, shredding it to pieces. It was used as both a method of punishment to mark breasts of unmarried mothers and women convinced of heresy, adultery, and hosts of other crimes, but also for interrogation, because nothing is gonna make someone confess to being a witch faster than a sociopath with a giant pair of tongs. Number 3 is a rear ripper. It's unlikely, but if there was anything worse than the breast ripper, it's probably the pair of anguish. Recognizable now from video games and movies and leather bedrooms with red latex accents, this pear-shaped device was one of the many horrific devices that made it to the modern world, but was reborn with better purposes. A few medical devices have taken a page out of its book, such as the dreaded thing they use at gynecology appointments, and some birthing and colonoscopy gear. So, the pear is made up of 4 leaves. These are joined at the hinge at the top and a key or a crank on one end. As you can see on screen, it's named accordingly. The pear was inserted into one of the 3 viable orifices, 2 if it's a dude, depending on the nature of the crime committed. The oral device was reserved for heretics, while the back door and the middle door pairs were used on, you could never guess. Witches, witchcraft, ooh. Man, medieval times must have looked like the set of Halloween Town, the way that witchcraft is constantly referenced. Anyways, turning the key opened the leaves, and every little click of the key causes massive internal damage that was rarely fatal, but very thorough way to get a confession out of someone, or just about anything. I'm pretty sure the average person would admit to something as ludicrous as riding a magic donkey out of the king's palace if it meant that would stop. Number 2 is another rear ripper. Yeah, they liked those. Come to think of it, for such a essentially repressed society, they seem to get quite raunchy with their punishments. It's almost like that's the reason you shouldn't repress feelings like that. The Judas cradle, also known as the gilded cradle, was a regular stool with a wooden or metal pyramid on the top. The victim would be stripped, tied with ropes on all 4 limbs, and then like some elaborate Marvel movie setup behind the scenes, they get lifted into the air and suspended just over top of the pyramid. Then their bits are adjusted to sit right on top of the pyramid. From here, the captive holder could torment them further, try to get confessions, whatever, before letting loose more and more of the person's own body weight, which would slowly impale them downwards on the pyramid, which in turn would start making room for itself. This punishment method was frequently used in the Inquisition, but I invite you to guess when else. Could it be A, witchcraft, B, witchcraft, or C, witchcraft? If you guessed any of those 3, you're right, because pretty much every medieval punishment for a woman was because she talked too much or made a soup that tasted too good, so the devil must have done it. Alright, the last in our little ripping montage, number 1 is the rail rip, aka a wooden horse, also known as riding the rail. It's an effed device of which there are 2 variations. The first is like a balance beam from gymnastics but triangular, mounted on a sawhorse-like support. The victim is made to straddle the triangular horse and place their full body weight down on the hoo-ha area, which rested on the blunt point of the angle. Weights and additional restraints were added to keep the victim from falling off, but also to drag them down. Left for days, it can begin destroying your pelvis as well as dislocate all of the joints in your legs. A less immediately painful variation is a single plank of wood supported again with the wooden legs or sometimes suspended from the ceiling, horizontal from the floor on its side with a thin edge and sharpened extremely. The victim is made to straddle the plank, which is adjusted to their height so that they have to stand on their tiptoes or let their hoo-ha, meet a very serrated fate. This wasn't a witchcraft one ironically, but rather for adulterers, working girls, or women who breathed a little too hard and their husbands wanted them gone.
Number 10. The pillory. Known sometimes as the thew, this was a form of stocks that was used for women. Men weren't the only ones who were condemned to the stocks back in the day. While on paper, standing around in the stocks for a few hours doesn't actually sound that bad, like a bit humiliating and a bit exhausting because you gotta keep your arms up here, but you know, that's about it. In reality, it could actually be very dangerous depending on the crowd's temperaments and the accused's reputation amongst the common folk that had gathered. In some cases, people were badly injured, maimed, blinded, and some actually died as a result of being tormented by those who gathered while they were in the stocks, after suffering great injuries. The unfortunate thing was that you often wouldn't be able to defend yourself because your hands are like restrained. You couldn't move your head, and often your hands are just completely restricted depending on the type of stocks that you're being held in. At least with the Thu version, your hands were not restricted because you were like kind of in a collar on a chain, but women also were put in the pillory too, where your hands are restricted, preventing you from defending yourself at all from assailants unless you were being defended by, like, I don't know, guards perhaps. Even then, you're probably still gonna be brutalized in some way. Guards aren't there to, like, you know, make sure that you don't get to feel the punishment. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee and you love when we tell you about some honestly very shocking things that happen in history, be sure to click that subscribe button for even more historical and horrific content. Number 9. Drunkard's cloak. While more popular in the 17th and 18th century, there is still documentation of the drunkard's cloak being used into the mid-19th century. It was a punishment given to both men and women, usually those who had a bit too much to drink. However, the punishment was also administered to women who were considered to be promiscuous, like so many of the things that are on this list. If you were sentenced to the drunkard's cloak, you'd basically be made to walk around town in like an upside down, heavy and cumbersome barrel with holes cut out for your head and your hands. Honestly, this is one of the least awful ones on the list. At least you're just in a barrel. It doesn't sound like it would be fun, but it doesn't sound like it would be like the worst. I feel like I could walk around for a few hours with a barrel on and I'd be alright. Number 8. Shrew's Fiddle. I have a question. Why are there so many devices that were created in the Middle Ages hundreds of years ago that were still used up until the early 1800s and beyond? That seems insane to me. The Shrew's Fiddle is one of those instruments, but despite being named after a musical instrument, it is instead an instrument of torment. It was used to punish women who were deemed too shrewish, and in some places in the world, it wasn't just used on women. The woman in question would be forced to put her neck through a large hole, with her wrists being held in the smaller holes, so her hands were basically up in front of her but were immobilized. Number 7. Scold's Bridle. Despite the fact that this device can be traced back to the 1500s, there are also records of it being used as late as the early 1800s into the 19th century, which is honestly crazy to me. Like, I can't even imagine someone trying to silence me with this device today. Goodness, horrific and humiliating. The Scold's Bridle was used to silence women who were being too loud, either speaking their mind too much, being caught gossiping, or just literally, being too loud. Pretty wild when you think the same society that decided this was a good punishment is also kind of the same society that encouraged women to gossip by pitting them against one another and also, silencing them, so that probably many women felt the only way they might be able to safely speak their minds about something was to, like whisper behind someone's back for fear of them hearing and what would happen then. But then of course, if you do get heard, this is what you get, because people are like, we don't want you to whisper, we just want you to shut up. Seems like a weird cycle though to me. It's like we created the problem and then we just basically punished people for the problem we created. This Scold's Bridle was a mask that women were forced to wear. Oftentimes it was made to look demonic or ugly in terms of the features on the mask, and it had a painful restricting metal gag inside that would literally hold down the wearer's tongue so they couldn't physically speak. Sounds terrible. Also, then if you try to speak, it could hurt your tongue. Not good. Number 6. Left to cook. While sitting by the fireplace is usually seen as being a pleasant way to pass the time, relaxing and soothing. In fact, I was just listening to some fireplace sounds while I was writing today. It becomes a lot less nice and tranquil if you are literally chained to the spot. While the Scold's Bridle is admittedly awful, it could actually get worse for women confined by the mask. In addition to that punishment, sometimes they would also be chained to the fireplace. Probably by their parents or guardian or their husband, whoever basically would have owned them at that time, until such a time as it was deemed they had learned their lesson. I like to sit by the fireplace, but I like to do it by choice.